Welcome to the Hidden Library. Tonight, we unlock a case from the archives of Baker Street, a mystery that begins with an iron key and ends with a revelation that chills the blood. When a wealthy banker is found dead in his locked study, clutching a key that fits no door in his house, even Scotland Yard stands baffled. But Sherlock Holmes sees what others miss, that sometimes the most puzzling clue holds the simplest truth, and the most innocent face conceals the darkest intent. If you enjoy mysteries like this, subscribe now. Your support keeps the Hidden Library alive and ensures more forgotten cases are brought to light. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence illuminates these fog-shrouded London streets. Now, pour yourself a brandy, draw close to the fire, and join Dr. Watson as he recounts the adventure of the Iron Latchkey. Chapter 1. The Curious Summons. The October of 1895 had settled upon London with a peculiar malevolence, wrapping the great city in a shroud of yellow fog that seemed to cling to every surface with the tenacity of some noxious creature. From my chair beside the fireplace in our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street, I watched the gaslight struggle to penetrate the gloom that pressed against our windows with an almost palpable weight. The very air seemed thick enough to slice, and the muffled sounds of hooves and wheels upon the cobblestones below took on a ghostly quality that would have been unsettling to any man of lesser constitution. Sherlock Holmes sat opposite me, his lean figure bent over a collection of correspondence that had arrived with the morning post. The dancing flames cast shifting shadows across his aquiline features as he examined each envelope with his magnifying glass, discarding most with the swift decisiveness that marked all his actions. His dressing gown, that familiar mouse-colored garment, was drawn close against the morning chill, and I observed that his long, nervous fingers moved with particular precision as he sorted through the day's communications. "Ah, Watson," said he, without raising his eyes from a letter bearing an official seal, "I perceive that Mrs. Hudson has been experimenting with a new variety of coal. The smoke carries a distinctly Welsh character, suggesting a delivery from the valleys rather than our usual Newcastle supply." I confess that such observations, delivered with Holmes's characteristic matter-of-fact tone, had long ceased to surprise me, though I remained perpetually amazed by the range of his knowledge. "Indeed, Holmes," I replied, settling deeper into my chair, "though I must say the change provides little improvement against this infernal fog." He looked up then, his grey eyes bright with that peculiar intensity I had come to associate with cases of unusual interest. "On the contrary, my dear fellow, this atmospheric condition proves most fortuitous for our purposes. Fog has a remarkable capacity for preserving evidence that might otherwise be lost to wind or rain. Mark my words, before this day is through, we shall have cause to be grateful for nature's assistance." Even as he spoke these prophetic words, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from the stairway, accompanied by Mrs. Hudson's familiar tones raised in gentle protest. Holmes's head tilted slightly, his expression taking on that alert quality of a hound catching an interesting scent. "Inspector Lestrade," he announced, returning the letters to their neat arrangement upon the table beside his chair. "And unless I am much mistaken, he brings news of a case that has already begun to perplex the official forces." The door burst open to admit our landlady, her round face flushed with the effort of keeping pace with her determined visitor. "Mr. Holmes," she began, but was immediately superseded by the entrance of Inspector Lestrade himself, his ferret-like features animated with an expression of barely contained excitement and frustration. "Holmes!" he exclaimed, pulling off his damp overcoat and shaking the moisture from his bowler hat. "I've come straight from Chester Square, and I'll tell you frankly, this business has me completely baffled." "Pray be seated, Lestrade," said Holmes, gesturing toward the chair I hastily vacated for our visitor. "Mrs. Hudson, perhaps you would be so good as to provide the inspector with some tea. The morning's fog has clearly taken its toll." As our excellent landlady bustled away to attend to this request, Lestrade settled himself with the air of a man carrying a burden he was eager to share. His sharp eyes darted between Holmes and myself, and I noted the unusual pallor beneath his weather-beaten complexion. "It's Horace Kelling," he began without preamble. "The banker. Found dead in his study this morning, locked from the inside, windows fastened tight. The coroner's preliminary examination suggests suicide, but—" He paused, running a hand through his thinning hair. "But you have reservations," Holmes observed, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "What particular aspect of the scene troubles you, Inspector?" Lestrade's eyes brightened at this display of interest. "It's the key, Holmes. An old iron thing, lying right beside the body as plain as day. Heavy piece, well made, but when we tested it against every lock in that house, it wouldn't fit a single one. Not the front door, not the study, not even the servants' quarters. What would a man want with a key that opens nothing?" Holmes leaned forward slightly, and I detected that familiar gleam in his eye that signaled the beginning of his engagement with a problem of genuine complexity. "Most intriguing. And you are certain the door was secured from within?" "Absolutely. Heavy oak door with a substantial lock, key still in place on the inside. Had to break it down to gain entry. The window latches show no signs of tampering, and there's a 20-foot drop to the garden below. No possible means of escape." Mrs. Hudson returned at this moment with a tea service, and the familiar ritual of cups and saucers provided a brief respite from the inspector's narrative. Yet I could see that Holmes's mind was already working upon the problem, his fingers drumming silently against the arm of his chair. "Tell me, Lestrade," said Holmes, as our visitor gratefully accepted his steaming cup. "What manner of man was this Horace Kelling? I assume his affairs were in order?" The inspector's expression grew grave. "That's just it, Holmes. The man was facing complete ruin. There's been talk of irregularities in some South African investments, questions about missing funds. His reputation was hanging by a thread. Every reason in the world to take his own life, yet the iron key troubles. You?" Holmes finished. "Quite rightly, Inspector. A key serves one fundamental purpose, to grant access where access is otherwise denied. Why then would a man about to take his own life concern himself with an implement that serves no apparent function?" The fog continued to press against our windows as we sat in contemplative silence, each man lost in his own thoughts regarding this curious puzzle that the morning had brought to our door. Chapter 2. The Sealed Chamber. The journey to Belgravia proved mercifully brief, though the fog that had shrouded Baker Street showed no signs of abating as our hansom cab navigated the familiar streets. Inspector Lestrade sat rigidly upright between Holmes and myself, occasionally consulting his pocket watch with the nervous precision of a man who had left important matters unattended. The clip-clop of hooves upon wet cobblestones provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the muffled sounds of London's morning commerce, while the gas lamps created wavering islands of yellow light in the grey murk. Chester Square presented an imposing array of Georgian architecture, its elegant facades rendered ghostly by the atmospheric conditions. Number 27 stood distinguished from its neighbours by the presence of a uniformed constable at the front entrance and the unmistakable signs of official investigation. A small crowd of curious onlookers despite the early hour, and the coming and going of various functionaries. "The household staff have been confined to the kitchen quarters," Lestrade explained as we alighted from our conveyance. "I've taken statements from all of them, but they're a nervous lot. Been with the family for years, they have. The front door, a magnificent specimen of polished mahogany adorned with brass fittings, admitted us into a hallway that spoke immediately of wealth and refined taste. The walls were panelled in dark wood, and a series of oil paintings depicting pastoral scenes gazed down upon us from their gilt frames. A crystal chandelier, though unlit in the grey morning light, dominated the space above an oriental carpet of evident quality. Holmes paused in the entrance, his keen eyes taking in every detail of our surroundings. I observed him noting the umbrella stand, the calling card tray, and the arrangement of walking sticks with the methodical attention he brought to all scenes of interest. His gaze lingered particularly upon the flooring, where the Turkish carpet met the polished wood of the surrounding border. "The study lies at the rear of the house," Lestrade informed us, leading the way down a corridor lined with bookcases. Kelling used it as his private office for banking correspondence, kept his personal papers there, conducted interviews with clients who preferred discretion. We passed several doorways, a morning room, a small library, and what appeared to be a formal dining room, before arriving at our destination. The study door stood open, revealing the scene of destruction where the police had been forced to break down the barrier that had sealed Horace Kelling's final moments from the outside world. The room itself was a study in masculine comfort and professional efficiency. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes on commerce, law, and financial history, while the 4th wall featured 2 tall windows that would normally have provided ample light, but now showed only the impenetrable grey of the October fog. A substantial desk of walnut occupied the center of the room, its surface arranged with the precise orderliness that suggested a methodical mind. It was behind this desk that Horace Kelling had met his end. The chalk outline marked by the police indicated where the body had been found, and I could see from the position that the man had fallen backward from his chair, striking his head upon the corner of a heavy filing cabinet that stood against the wall. "The wound was here," I observed, kneeling to examine the dark stain upon the carpet. A single blow to the temporal region, consistent with the sharp corner of the cabinet. Death would have been instantaneous. Holmes had moved immediately to the windows, testing each latch with his long fingers. "Secured from within," he murmured, and showing no signs of recent manipulation. The paint upon the hardware remains undisturbed. He turned his attention to the fireplace, a modest affair with a marble surround, noting the cold ashes and the absence of any disturbance to the andirons or grate. "Now then," said Lestrade, producing a small object wrapped in brown paper. "Here's the item that's been puzzling us all." He unwrapped what proved to be an iron key of considerable age and weight, its surface darkened by time and use. The head was ornately fashioned in a style I recognized as being several decades old, while the shaft and teeth showed the precise workmanship of a master craftsman. Holmes accepted the key with evident interest, weighing it in his palm before holding it up to catch what light filtered through the fog-shrouded windows. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Note the quality of the iron, Watson, and the particular style of the head. This key was fashioned during the middle years of this century, I should estimate, and by someone who took considerable pride in his craft." "We found it lying just here," Lestrade continued, indicating a spot upon the carpet near where the chalk outline showed the position of Kelling's outstretched right hand. "Placed deliberately, it seemed to me, not dropped by accident." I watched Holmes examine the carpet surrounding the indicated area, his magnifying glass moving methodically across the fibers. His expression remained impassive, but I had observed him long enough to recognize the subtle signs of excitement that accompanied a significant discovery. "Have you tested this key against all the locks in the house?" Holmes inquired, straightening from his examination. "Every single one," Lestrade replied with evident frustration. Front door, back door, study door, all the bedrooms, even the servants' quarters and the wine cellar. It fits nothing, Holmes. Absolutely nothing. Holmes moved to the broken study door, examining the heavy oak panels and the substantial lock that had secured the room from within. The splintered wood around the frame showed where the police had applied their efforts, but the lock itself remained intact, its mechanism undamaged. "The key was found in the lock when you broke down the door?" he asked. "Still in place on the inside, turned to the locked position. Had to reach through the gap to turn it before we could open what remained of the door." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then began a systematic examination of the room's contents. He studied the arrangement of papers upon the desk, noted the position of the inkwell and blotter, and paid particular attention to a small safe that stood open in the corner, its contents apparently undisturbed. "The safe was found in this condition?" he inquired. "Yes, though according to the butler, Kelling rarely left it open. Kept his most important documents there, along with a considerable sum in banknotes." As Holmes continued his methodical investigation, I found myself drawn to the windows once more, peering out into the fog-shrouded garden beyond. The drop to the ground below was indeed considerable, and the flower beds directly beneath showed no signs of disturbance, despite the morning's heavy moisture. Yet something about the scene continued to trouble me, some element that seemed inconsistent with the apparent facts of the case. Holmes completed his examination and stood in the center of the room, his grey eyes moving from the iron key to the broken door, then to the windows and back again. The expression upon his sharp features suggested a mind grappling with a puzzle of unusual complexity, and I knew that the mystery of Horace Kelling's death had already begun to engage his remarkable powers of deduction. Chapter 3. The Banker's Burden. The fog had begun to lift by the time Holmes and I made our way through the labyrinthine streets of the city toward Threadneedle Street, where the banking house of Kelling and Associates maintained its offices. The October morning had grown no warmer, and the damp chill seemed to penetrate even the heaviest of overcoats, yet I observed that Holmes walked with that particular spring in his step that indicated his mind was fully engaged with the problem at hand. "Tell me, Watson," said he as we navigated past a crossing sweeper who tipped his cap in recognition of our generous contribution to his morning's labor. "What did you make of the household staff's demeanor during our brief interview?" I considered the question carefully, recalling the nervous fidgeting of the butler, a dignified man named Pemberton, who had served the Kelling family for nearly 2 decades. "They seemed genuinely distressed by their master's death," I replied, though I detected an undercurrent of anxiety that seemed to extend beyond mere grief. "Precisely. The anxiety of servants who fear for their positions when the family fortunes are uncertain. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, mentioned that several staff had already been dismissed in recent months. A telling detail, would you not agree? The banking district presented its usual scene of purposeful activity, despite the atmospheric conditions. Clerks hurried along the pavements with leather satchels clutched beneath their arms, while the occasional gentleman of evident prosperity made his way toward one of the many financial institutions that lined these storied streets. The very air seemed charged with the energy of commerce, that peculiar blend of ambition and anxiety that characterizes the world of high finance. Kelling and Associates occupied a narrow but elegant building, wedged between a firm of solicitors and an insurance office. The brass nameplate beside the entrance had been polished to a high shine, though I noted that it bore only the name Kelling, suggesting that any associates had long since departed the concern. We were received by a clerk of middle years, whose name, he informed us, was Grimsby. His manner was respectful but guarded, and I observed that he cast frequent glances toward the stairs leading to what had presumably been Horace Kelling's private office. "Terrible business, gentlemen," Grimsby said, adjusting his spectacles with nervous precision. "Mr. Kelling was a gentleman of the old school, though these recent troubles had weighed heavily upon him, very heavily indeed. Holmes settled himself into the chair that Grimsby offered, his keen eyes taking in the modest appointments of the outer office. "These troubles," he began, "I understand they concerned certain investments in South African mining ventures." The clerk's expression grew even more troubled. "The Johannesburg Consolidated Mining Company," he said, lowering his voice as though speaking the name aloud might summon further calamity. Mr. Kelling had convinced several prominent families to invest substantial sums based on geological reports that proved to be optimistic. When did the true nature of these investments become apparent? I inquired. "The cables began arriving 3 weeks ago," Grimsby replied, producing a file from his desk drawer. First came news that the mine shafts had flooded, then word that the ore deposits were far less extensive than originally surveyed. Within a fortnight, the entire enterprise had collapsed. Holmes examined the correspondence that Grimsby provided, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. "Lord Pembroke, Sir Charles Whitfield, the Honourable Mrs. Ashworth," he murmured, reading from the list of investors. Substantial sums indeed. What was the total amount involved? "Nearly £40,000. Grimsby whispered, the figure seeming to pain him physically. Money that these families could ill afford to lose. Lord Pembroke had mortgaged his estate, while Sir Charles had drawn upon his daughter's dowries. The weight of this revelation settled upon us like a pall. I had served long enough in Her Majesty's forces to understand the devastating impact such losses could have upon families of the upper classes, whose wealth often existed more in reputation than in liquid assets. "And Mr. Kelling's personal involvement?" Holmes asked. He had pledged his own funds as a guarantee of the investment's soundness. Grimsby explained. A gesture of confidence that unfortunately proved catastrophic. The bank's remaining assets would barely cover half the losses, leaving Mr. Kelling personally liable for the remainder. From Threadneedle Street, we made our way to the Savoy Club, where Kelling had maintained his membership for the better part of 20 years. The establishment occupied a dignified building in Pall Mall, its interior appointments reflecting the conservative tastes of the banking and legal professions that comprised its membership. The club secretary, a rotund gentleman named Fortescue, received us in the smoking room, where the leather chairs and dark panelling created an atmosphere of masculine comfort. Several members sat reading their newspapers or engaged in quiet conversation, their voices creating a low murmur that spoke of serious discussions of serious matters. "Poor Horace," Fortescue said, settling his considerable bulk into a chair that creaked under the strain. "I feared something of this sort might happen. The man had aged 10 years in as many weeks, and his usual appetite for the club's excellent cuisine had quite disappeared." "Had he spoken to you of his troubles?" Holmes inquired. "Only in the most general terms," Fortescue replied, "but one could see the weight of responsibility crushing him. He spoke often of duty to his investors, of honor requiring him to make good their losses even if it meant his own ruin. Were there others who might have benefited from his death?" I asked, though the question seemed indelicate given the circumstances. Fortescue's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, there is his nephew Edgar, of course, a pleasant enough young man, though somewhat given to living beyond his means. Works as a filing clerk at Rothschild's, I believe, though his salary would hardly support the lifestyle he affects. Horace had mentioned his concerns about the boy's financial habits on more than one occasion." As we prepared to leave the club, Holmes paused to examine the visitor's book, noting the names of those who had called upon Kelling in recent weeks. One entry in particular seemed to catch his attention. A visit from Edgar Kelling dated merely 3 days before his uncle's death. The afternoon had grown considerably brighter by the time we emerged onto Pall Mall, though the October air retained its sharp edge. Holmes walked in silence for several minutes, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic posture that indicated deep thought. "An interesting web begins to emerge, Watson," he said finally as we hailed a hansom cab for the return journey to Baker Street. "A man facing financial ruin, a nephew with expensive tastes and a modest income, and a locked-room mystery that defies conventional explanation." The ride back to our lodgings provided an opportunity for reflection upon the day's discoveries. As London's familiar streets passed by our windows, I found myself considering the tragic figure of Horace Kelling, a man whose generosity and confidence had led not only to his own destruction, but to the ruin of those who had trusted in his judgment. Yet beneath the apparent simplicity of suicide lay questions that demanded answers, chief among them the mystery of the iron key that served no apparent purpose, yet had been placed so deliberately beside the dead man's hand. Chapter 4. The Nephew's Tale. The following morning brought with it a crisp clarity that stood in marked contrast to the previous day's atmospheric gloom. From the windows of 221B Baker Street, I could observe the bustling activity of London's streets with unusual distinctness, and even Holmes remarked upon the change as he consumed his customary breakfast of coffee and toast. "An excellent day for observation, Watson," said he, consulting his pocket watch. "I propose we pay a visit to young Edgar Kelling before he departs for his duties at Rothschild's. First impressions, as you well know, are often the most revealing." The journey to Bloomsbury carried us through streets that grew progressively less prosperous as we travelled northward from our comfortable quarters in Marylebone. The elegant Georgian terraces gave way to more modest accommodations, and by the time our hansom cab deposited us before a narrow building that housed both commercial premises and residential lodgings, we had entered a distinctly different stratum of London society. The tobacconist's shop that occupied the ground floor displayed its wares in a window, grimy with the accumulated dust of many seasons, while a sign painted in fading letters advertised "Superior Turkish and Virginia Blends." A narrow doorway beside the shop entrance bore a brass plate listing the various tenants of the floors above, among which I noted E. Kelling, Esq., inscribed in a hand that aspired to elegance but achieved only pretension. Holmes rang the bell with characteristic decisiveness, and we were presently admitted by Edgar Kelling himself. The young man appeared to be in his late 20s, of medium height and slender build, with fair hair that showed the effects of a hasty morning toilette. His attire, while clean and carefully pressed, bore the unmistakable signs of a wardrobe maintained on a modest budget, yet employed to create an impression of greater prosperity. "Gentlemen," said he, his voice carrying the educated accents of a man who had enjoyed the benefits of good schooling, "I confess I had not expected visitors at so early an hour. Pray forgive the humble nature of my accommodations." His sitting-room, though small, had been arranged with evident care to maximize both comfort and dignity. A few good pieces of furniture, clearly inherited rather than purchased, stood upon a carpet that had seen better days but remained serviceable. Books lined makeshift shelves constructed from planks and bricks, while a writing desk by the window held neat stacks of correspondence and what appeared to be financial calculations. "We are investigating the circumstances surrounding your uncle's death," Holmes began without preamble, settling himself into the chair that Edgar offered. "Inspector Lestrade has asked for our assistance in clarifying certain aspects of the case." Edgar's face immediately assumed an expression of profound grief, though I observed that his hands, which had been steady as he arranged papers upon his desk, now betrayed a slight tremor. "Poor Uncle Horace," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I cannot believe he would take such a drastic step, yet the evidence seems overwhelming." "You were aware of his financial difficulties?" I inquired. "Only in the most general terms," Edgar replied, moving to the window where he stood with his back partially turned toward us. Uncle Horace was not a man to burden others with his troubles, but I could see that something was weighing heavily upon him during our recent meetings. Holmes leaned forward with interest. "You met with him recently?" 3 days before his death. Edgar confirmed. I had hoped to discuss my own situation with him, certain debts that had accumulated beyond my ability to service them on my current salary. But he seemed so distracted, so unlike his usual composed self, that I found myself unable to burden him further. I noted that Edgar's cuffs, while clean, showed signs of frequent washing and careful mending. More significantly, both cuffs bore dark stains that appeared to be ink, though of an unusual blue-black hue that differed from the common writing ink visible upon his desk. "Your work at Rothschild's?" Holmes observed. "It involves considerable amounts of paperwork, I assume." "Filing, primarily." Edgar replied with a slight flush of embarrassment. "I maintain records of transactions, organize correspondence, ensure that documents are properly categorized and stored. It is not glamorous work, but it provides a steady income." Holmes rose and moved to examine the books upon Edgar's improvised shelves, noting titles on banking, commerce, and investment. "You have aspirations beyond filing, I perceive." "Indeed," Edgar said, his manner growing more animated. "I have studied the principles of finance extensively, and I hope one day to secure a position of greater responsibility." Uncle Horace had occasionally hinted that he might be able to assist in such advancement, but recent events— His voice trailed off, and he turned once more to the window. "Had your uncle ever given you access to his house?" Holmes asked with apparent casualness. "He provided me with a key to the front entrance some months ago," Edgar replied, "so that I might call upon him without disturbing the servants unnecessarily. But I was never admitted to his private study. That was his sanctuary, where he conducted his most confidential business." Holmes moved to the writing desk, his keen eyes taking in the various papers and implements arranged there. Among the items I observed a small bottle of the unusual blue-black ink, its label indicating a specialized formulation used for permanent record-keeping. "This ink," Holmes commented, "it appears to be of a professional grade." "Required for my work at Rothschild's," Edgar explained. "All permanent records must be maintained in this particular formulation to prevent fading or alteration. I find it convenient to use the same ink for my personal correspondence." As we prepared to take our leave, Edgar accompanied us to the door, his manner that of a man eager to be helpful, yet anxious to return to his morning routine. He mentioned his need to depart soon for his duties, explaining that punctuality was essential in his position. "One final question," Holmes said as we paused upon the threshold. "Had your uncle ever spoken to you of hidden passages or secret chambers within his house? It is not uncommon in buildings of that period." Edgar's expression showed genuine surprise. "Hidden passages?" I cannot recall Uncle Horace ever mentioning such things, though he did occasionally speak of the house's history. It had been in the family for several generations, I believe, and he took considerable pride in its architectural features. The walk back to the main thoroughfare provided an opportunity for Holmes to share his initial impressions of our interview. His expression was thoughtful, and I could see that various aspects of Edgar's demeanor and circumstances had engaged his analytical faculties. "An interesting young man," he observed as we waited for a cab. "Educated beyond his current station, financially pressed, yet maintaining appearances with considerable skill. Note the quality of his speech, Watson, contrasted with the humble nature of his lodgings." I reflected upon our encounter as London's familiar streets carried us back toward Baker Street. Edgar Kelling had struck me as a man caught between aspirations and reality, struggling to maintain dignity while facing circumstances that threatened to overwhelm him. Yet beneath his apparent grief and financial anxiety, I had detected something else, a quality of nervous energy that suggested the working of a mind under considerable strain. Chapter 5. Secrets in Stone and Mortar. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Chester Square as Holmes and I returned to the Kelling residence, armed now with a deeper understanding of the family's circumstances and the pressures that had weighed upon the deceased banker. The constable at the door recognized us from our previous visit and admitted us without question, though I observed that the household staff moved about their duties with the subdued manner of servants whose future employment remained uncertain. "I should like to examine the house's architecture more thoroughly," Holmes announced to Inspector Lestrade, whom we found in the morning room reviewing his notes. Edgar Kelling's casual mention of hidden passages has intrigued me considerably. Lestrade looked up from his papers with evident skepticism. Hidden passages? Surely you don't place credence in such Gothic notions, Holmes. On the contrary, my companion replied, producing a measuring tape from his coat pocket. Georgian houses of this period were often constructed with servants' passages to allow for discreet movement throughout the building. The wealthy families who commissioned such homes valued their privacy above all else. We began our architectural investigation in the entrance hall, where Holmes set about measuring the distances between doorways with meticulous precision. I assisted by recording his findings in my notebook, noting discrepancies that suggested concealed spaces within the walls. The process proved tedious yet fascinating, as Holmes demonstrated his remarkable knowledge of period construction techniques. "Observe, Watson," said he, indicating a section of paneling in the corridor leading to the study. "The spacing here is irregular. This panel is some 18 inches wider than its companions, yet the visible joinery suggests uniform construction." Moving to the study itself, Holmes began a systematic examination of the room's dimensions, comparing the internal measurements with what we could observe of the building's external structure. His calculations revealed a significant discrepancy along the wall that housed the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. "If my measurements are correct," he said, running his hands along the shelving with practiced expertise, "there should be a space of approximately 4 feet in width behind this wall, more than sufficient for a passage." I watched with growing excitement as Holmes examined each section of the bookshelf, testing individual panels and searching for some mechanism that might reveal a concealed entrance. His persistence was rewarded when he discovered that one particular section, containing volumes on architectural history, could be moved independently of its mounting. "Ah," he murmured with satisfaction. "The books are secured to a false front. Note how they swing away as a unit when pressure is applied to this corner." Behind the movable section lay a narrow opening, its entrance partially obscured by loose bricks and mortar that had been hastily arranged to conceal the passage beyond. Holmes produced his pocket torch and directed its beam into the darkness, revealing a corridor that extended into the depths of the house's structure. "Recently disturbed," he observed, kneeling to examine the debris at the passage entrance. "This mortar dust is fresh, Watson, no more than a few weeks old at most. Someone has been at considerable pains to reopen this passage after it had been sealed for years. The passage itself proved to be a marvel of Georgian engineering, constructed with the same attention to detail that characterized the visible portions of the house. The walls were lined with brick, and though narrow, the corridor was high enough to allow a man of average height to pass through without difficulty. Note the construction, Watson," Holmes said as we made our careful way through the passage, our torches casting dancing shadows on the ancient brickwork. "The craftsmanship is exceptional, with proper ventilation and drainage to prevent deterioration. Our exploration revealed that the passage connected several points within the house, including access to the kitchen quarters, the main stairway, and most significantly, a concealed entrance to the study itself. This entrance was ingeniously designed, appearing from within the study as nothing more than a section of decorative paneling. Holmes knelt to examine the mechanism that controlled this inner entrance, noting fresh scratches on the metal fittings and traces of recent oil upon the hinges. "Someone has been maintaining this mechanism," he observed. "These hinges move far too smoothly for a passage that has been sealed for decades." Our investigation of the passage floor proved equally revealing. Holmes's torch illuminated footprints in the accumulated dust, though the prints were partial and indistinct. More telling was his discovery of what appeared to be recent disturbances in the debris, suggesting that someone had passed through the corridor within the past few days. "The soot patterns are particularly interesting," Holmes remarked, directing my attention to dark smudges along the passage walls. "Note how the accumulation has been disturbed at shoulder height, exactly where a person might brush against the wall while navigating in limited light." Returning to the study through the concealed entrance, Holmes began a careful examination of the area around the secret panel. His magnifying glass revealed traces of the same fresh mortar dust we had observed at the passage entrance, suggesting that whoever had used this route had carried evidence of their excavation work into the room itself. "Most illuminating," he said, straightening from his examination. The dust pattern extends from the concealed entrance towards the position where Horace Kelling's body was found. Our mysterious visitor clearly entered the study through this passage. Holmes then turned his attention to examining the lock mechanism of the secret entrance from within the study. To our surprise, he discovered that this ancient door was equipped with a distinctive lock, one that would require a specific key for operation. "The iron key," I exclaimed, the significance of our discovery suddenly becoming clear. "The key found beside Kelling's body. Could it operate this lock?" "An excellent deduction, Watson," Holmes replied with evident satisfaction, "though we must test the theory to be certain." Inspector Lestrade, who had observed our investigation with growing amazement, produced the mysterious iron key from his evidence pouch. Holmes accepted it with reverence, noting once again its weight and craftsmanship before inserting it into the ancient lock mechanism. The key turned smoothly, its teeth engaging with the lock's internal mechanisms as though the two had been crafted specifically for each other. The satisfying click of the tumblers falling into place confirmed what Holmes had suspected from the beginning. "Our iron latchkey has found its purpose at last," he announced with evident satisfaction. "This passage, sealed for years and recently reopened, provided our murderer with the perfect means of gaining access to a locked room." As we stood in the study, contemplating the implications of our architectural discovery, the afternoon light streaming through the windows illuminated motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to the secrets we had uncovered. The mystery of Horace Kelling's death had taken on an entirely new dimension, transforming from an apparent suicide into a carefully planned murder that had exploited the hidden features of the victim's own home. Chapter 6. The Trail of Evidence. The discovery of the hidden passage had transformed our investigation from a perplexing suicide into a methodical hunt for a clever murderer. Holmes attacked the problem with renewed vigor, and I observed that familiar gleam in his grey eyes that indicated his faculties were now fully engaged with a challenge worthy of his talents. "The key to solving this mystery, Watson," said he as we prepared to leave Chester Square, "lies not merely in discovering how the crime was committed, but in tracing the preparation that made it possible. Our murderer has been planning this deed for some considerable time. Our first destination was a modest establishment in Clerkenwell, where Holmes had located the craftsman responsible for maintaining the old locks of several historic London properties. The shop of Jeremiah Blackwood occupied the ground floor of a building that appeared to have witnessed the passing of several centuries, its narrow windows and weathered brick facade speaking of Georgian origins. Blackwood himself proved to be a man in his 60s, with the gnarled hands and keen eyes of one who had spent a lifetime working with metal and mechanisms. His workshop was a fascinating collection of ancient locks, keys, and the specialized tools of his trade, while the walls displayed examples of his craftsmanship spanning several decades. "Ah, yes," said he when Holmes produced the iron latchkey. "I remember this piece well. Came to me about 3 weeks past, brought by a young gentleman who claimed it was a family heirloom in need of restoration." Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "Can you describe this gentleman?" "Fair-haired fellow, well-spoken, though his clothes suggested modest circumstances. He seemed particularly knowledgeable about old lock mechanisms, asked very specific questions about the key's original purpose and whether it could be restored to working condition." "And you were able to assist him?" Blackwood nodded with professional pride. "The key required considerable work. The teeth had been worn smooth by years of use, and the internal mechanisms of the lock it was designed to operate had accumulated decades of rust and debris. But I've worked on similar pieces before, and I was able to restore both key and lock to perfect working order." "The lock itself?" I inquired. "You actually examined the mechanism it was designed to operate?" "Indeed, sir. The young gentleman provided me with detailed drawings of the lock housing, claimed he'd measured it himself as part of his research into the family's architectural history. Quite thorough work, actually. Every dimension precisely recorded." Holmes and I exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing the significance of this revelation. Edgar Kelling had not merely stumbled upon the hidden passage. He had researched its mechanisms with the thoroughness of a man planning to put that knowledge to practical use. Our next visit took us to the establishment of Hartwell and Sons, dealers in antique furniture and architectural salvage. The proprietor, a dignified gentleman named Hartwell, recalled the transaction clearly when Holmes described Edgar Kelling's appearance and the approximate date of his visit. Young Mr. Kelling was most interested in the history of Georgian domestic architecture, Hartwell explained as he led us through his crowded showroom. He purchased several books on the subject, as well as detailed plans of houses built during that period, claimed to be writing a scholarly article on hidden passages and servants' quarters. Holmes examined the volumes that Hartwell indicated, noting their comprehensive coverage of concealed architectural features in London townhouses. Did he express particular interest in any specific property? He did mention a house in Chester Square, Hartwell admitted. Said it was his family's residence and that he was researching its original construction for historical purposes. From our visit to Hartwell's establishment, we proceeded to Rothschild's banking house, where Edgar Kelling pursued his daily employment. Holmes had arranged this visit under the pretense of inquiring about commercial banking services, but his true purpose was to observe Edgar's workplace and the distinctive ink that had caught his attention during our morning interview. The banking house presented an atmosphere of quiet efficiency, with clerks bent over their ledgers and correspondence in the methodical pursuit of financial accuracy. We were received by the chief clerk, a stern gentleman named Morrison, who showed us through the various departments while explaining the bank's services. "Our filing department maintains all permanent records," Morrison explained as we passed through a room where several clerks, including Edgar Kelling, worked at tall desks arranged in precise rows. "Every document is recorded in permanent ink to prevent alteration or fading." I observed Edgar at his work, noting the careful precision with which he handled documents and the distinctive blue-black ink that marked all his entries. More significantly, I noticed that his right cuff bore a fresh stain of the same unusual ink, despite his obvious efforts to keep his clothing clean. Holmes engaged Morrison in conversation about the bank's record-keeping procedures, while I conducted my own discreet observation of the filing department. The work appeared to require considerable attention to detail. and I could see that Edgar possessed the methodical mind necessary for such employment. Yet there was something in his manner that suggested distraction from his duties. "Mr. Kelling," Morrison noted when Holmes inquired about the staff, "is one of our most reliable clerks, though he has seemed somewhat preoccupied in recent weeks. Personal troubles, I believe, though he maintains his professional standards admirably." After completing our business at the bank, Holmes suggested we visit Edgar's lodgings once more, this time in his absence. A brief conversation with the tobacconist who served as his landlord revealed several interesting details about the young man's recent activities. "Been coming and going at odd hours lately," the tobacconist confided as he arranged his display of pipes and tobacco pouches. "Used to keep regular banker's hours, but these past weeks I've heard him on the stairs at all times of day and night. Thought perhaps he'd taken ill, but he seems healthy enough when I see him." "Has he had any unusual visitors?" Holmes inquired. "Can't say as I've noticed any visitors at all," the man replied. "Keeps to himself, does Mr. Kelling, though I did see him carrying some old books and papers up to his room a few weeks back. Heavy stuff, looked like it was from some dusty library or such." The tobacconist's information confirmed what we had already begun to suspect. Edgar Kelling's recent behavior indicated a man engaged in activities that extended far beyond his normal routine. The pattern of late-night absences, combined with his research into architectural history and lock mechanisms, painted a picture of careful preparation for some significant undertaking. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Holmes and I made our way back to Baker Street, where the familiar comfort of our lodgings provided an opportunity to review the day's discoveries. Holmes settled into his chair by the fire, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose that indicated deep contemplation. "The evidence begins to form a coherent pattern, Watson," he said finally. "Edgar Kelling has demonstrated both the knowledge and the opportunity to commit this crime, yet we must be certain of our facts before we proceed with accusations." I reflected upon the day's investigations as I prepared my notes for the case file. The image of Edgar Kelling that emerged from our inquiries was that of a young man under considerable pressure, driven perhaps to desperate measures by circumstances beyond his control. Yet the methodical nature of his preparations suggested a calculating mind capable of planning and executing a complex crime with remarkable attention to detail. Chapter 7. The Net Closes. The grey dawn of our fourth day of investigation found Holmes in a state of intense concentration, surrounded by the various pieces of evidence we had assembled throughout our inquiries. From my position at the breakfast table, I observed him arranging and rearranging photographs, notes, and physical specimens with the methodical precision of a chess master contemplating his final moves. "The time has come, Watson," said he, looking up from his careful arrangement, "to weave these scattered threads into a complete tapestry of guilt. Every element of our investigation points to a single, inescapable conclusion." He began his exposition with characteristic thoroughness, drawing connections between facts that had seemed disparate during our individual discoveries. The iron latchkey, Edgar Kelling's research into architectural history, the specialized ink stains, and the evidence of recent activity in the hidden passage, all formed links in a chain of evidence that would prove difficult for any jury to ignore. "Consider the sequence of events, my dear fellow," Holmes continued, moving to the window where the morning light illuminated his sharp features. "Edgar Kelling, facing financial ruin and knowing of his uncle's similar predicament, conceived a plan of remarkable audacity. He would inherit his uncle's estate while simultaneously eliminating the only witness to certain irregularities in his own financial affairs." Holmes explained how Edgar had used his access to Rothschild's extensive records to research the architectural history of Chester Square properties, discovering references to the hidden passages that honeycombed many Georgian houses. Armed with this knowledge, He had sought out the old iron key through antique dealers and arranged for its restoration by Mr. Blackwood. The young man's preparation was meticulous, Holmes observed. He spent weeks studying the house's structure, timing the servants' routines, and perfecting his knowledge of the concealed passages. When the moment came to act, he was ready. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street shortly after 10 o'clock, bringing with him the warrant Holmes had requested for Edgar Kelling's arrest. The inspector's manner showed both excitement and apprehension, for while he trusted Holmes's deductions implicitly, the complexity of the case required considerable explanation for his superiors at Scotland Yard. "Are you certain we have sufficient evidence?" Lestrade inquired as we prepared to depart for Chester Square. "The circumstantial nature of much of our proof may present challenges in court." "The ink stain will provide conclusive physical evidence," Holmes replied with confidence. "Combined with witness testimony regarding Edgar's research and preparation, we shall have a case that admits of no reasonable doubt." Our journey to Belgravia carried us through streets that had become familiar during our investigation, yet the atmosphere seemed charged with the tension of approaching resolution. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, reviewing once more the details of the confrontation he had planned, while I found myself considering the human tragedy that lay at the heart of our professional success. At the Kelling residence, we were joined by Edgar himself, whom Lestrade had summoned under the pretense of requiring additional information about his uncle's affairs. The young man arrived punctually, his manner composed, though I detected an underlying nervousness in his quick glances and restless movements. "Gentlemen," Edgar said as we assembled in the familiar study where his uncle had met his death, "I hope I can be of assistance in resolving the questions surrounding this tragic affair." Holmes positioned himself beside the concealed entrance to the secret passage, while Lestrade and I flanked the room's conventional exit. The stage was set for what promised to be a dramatic revelation of guilt and a final confrontation between hunter and prey. "Mr. Kelling," Holmes began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "I have asked you here to explain certain discrepancies that have emerged during our investigation. Chief among these is the matter of your whereabouts 3 evenings ago." Edgar's composure remained intact, though I observed a slight tightening around his eyes. "I was working late at the bank, as I mentioned previously. The filing of the consolidated mining correspondence required considerable attention. Yet Mr. Morrison, your supervisor, has informed us that you departed the bank at your usual hour that evening." Holmes replied smoothly. "He specifically recalls your punctual departure because he had intended to assign you additional duties." The color drained from Edgar's face, but he maintained his stance. "Then I must have been mistaken about the date. These recent troubles have affected my memory considerably." Holmes moved closer to the young man, producing from his pocket a small glass vial containing what appeared to be dried ink. "This substance was found near your uncle's body, Mr. Kelling. It matches precisely the specialized blue-black ink used exclusively by Rothschild's filing department." "Surely such ink is not uncommon," Edgar protested, though his voice had begun to betray the strain he was experiencing. "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "this particular formulation is manufactured exclusively for 3 banking houses in London. More significantly, this sample contains fibers of cloth that match precisely the fabric of your shirt cuff." As if on cue, Holmes gestured toward Edgar's right sleeve, where the telltale stain was clearly visible, despite the young man's obvious efforts to conceal it. The evidence was damning in its specificity, linking Edgar directly to the scene of his uncle's death through physical proof that could not be explained away. The hidden passage, the restored key, the specialized ink, all point to a carefully planned murder executed with considerable skill. Holmes continued relentlessly. "Yet your greatest error, Mr. Kelling, was in leaving the iron latchkey beside your uncle's body. You intended it as a red herring, but instead it provided the crucial clue that unraveled your entire scheme. Edgar's facade finally crumbled under the weight of Holmes's methodical presentation. His shoulders sagged, and I observed the transformation from confident young clerk to defeated criminal occur in the space of a few heartbeats. The game, as Holmes would say, was indeed afoot, and our quarry had been successfully cornered. The afternoon sun slanted through the study windows as Edgar Kelling's carefully constructed alibi dissolved under the inexorable pressure of logical deduction and physical evidence. Justice, it seemed, would soon claim another victory through the application of scientific method to criminal investigation. Chapter 8. The Iron Truth. The gaslight flickered warmly against the familiar walls of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street as Holmes and I settled into our accustomed chairs for the evening. The events at Chester Square had concluded with Edgar Kelling's complete breakdown and confession, followed by his removal to Scotland Yard in the custody of Inspector Lestrade. The young man's final words, spoken through tears of remorse and desperation, had revealed the full extent of his criminal planning and the financial pressures that had driven him to murder his own uncle. "A most instructive case, Watson," Holmes observed, reaching for his pipe with the satisfied air of a man who had successfully unraveled a particularly complex puzzle. Young Kelling possessed intelligence and education in abundance, yet he lacked the moral fortitude necessary to endure temporary hardship with dignity. I found myself reflecting upon the human tragedy we had witnessed, for Edgar's confession had revealed circumstances of considerable pathos. The young man had embezzled funds from his employers at Rothschild's to support gambling debts contracted during his attempts to maintain the social position he believed his education entitled him to claim. When discovery appeared imminent, he had seen his uncle's inheritance as his only salvation. His plan was remarkably sophisticated, I observed, consulting my notes from the day's revelations. The research into architectural history, the restoration of the ancient quay, the careful timing of his movements, all demonstrated considerable forethought. Holmes nodded, sending a stream of aromatic smoke toward the ceiling. Indeed, yet he failed to account for the one factor that proves the downfall of so many criminals, the psychological pressure of guilt. Had he simply disposed of the iron key rather than leaving it as a false clue, he might well have escaped detection. The confession had revealed the complete sequence of events on that fatal evening. Edgar had used his legitimate key to enter his uncle's house after the servants had retired, then accessed the hidden passage through the concealed entrance he had discovered during his architectural research. The restored iron latchkey had granted him silent entry to the study, where he found his uncle working late over correspondence related to the South African mining disaster. The actual confrontation was brief. Holmes continued, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe. Edgar attempted to convince his uncle to provide immediate financial assistance, claiming that exposure of his embezzlement would bring scandal upon the family name. When Horace Kelling refused and threatened to inform the authorities himself, Edgar struck him with a paperweight from the desk. The blow had proven fatal, with Horace Kelling falling backward against the filing cabinet in the manner we had observed. Edgar had then arranged the scene to suggest suicide, placing the iron key beside the body in the hope that its mysterious presence would confuse investigators and support the theory of self-destruction by a man facing financial ruin. His error in calculation was fundamental, Holmes explained. He assumed that the key's apparent uselessness would mystify the police sufficiently to prevent thorough investigation. Instead, it provided the thread that, when pulled, unraveled his entire scheme. Mrs. Hudson appeared at this moment with our evening meal, her kindly face bearing an expression of satisfaction at having her lodgers safely returned from their latest adventure. The familiar ritual of dining provided a pleasant counterpoint to our discussion of criminal methodology, and I found myself appreciating anew the comfortable domesticity of our shared quarters. As we dined, Holmes explained the final details of Edgar's downfall, the young man's attempts to establish an alibi by remaining at his workplace until the normal closing hour had been undermined by his supervisor's specific recollection of his departure. More damaging still was the physical evidence of the specialized ink, which had transferred from his sleeve to his uncle's study during the struggle. The peculiar formulation used by Rothschilds proved to be his undoing, Holmes noted with professional appreciation. Had he committed the crime while wearing different clothing, that crucial link might never have been established. Inspector Lestrade had expressed considerable satisfaction with the case's resolution, particularly given the elegant solution to what had initially appeared to be an impossible crime. The locked room mystery that had so puzzled the official investigation had yielded to methodical analysis and the application of specialized knowledge regarding Georgian architecture. Lestrade deserves considerable credit for recognizing the significance of the iron key, I observed. A less perceptive officer might have dismissed it as irrelevant to the investigation. Holmes smiled with genuine warmth. Indeed, the inspector's instincts have improved markedly through our association. He has learned to value seemingly insignificant details that might prove crucial to understanding a crime's true nature. As the evening progressed, we turned our conversation to the broader implications of the case. Edgar Kelling's crime had been born of social pressures and financial anxiety, yet his education and opportunities should have provided alternatives to murder. The tragedy lay not merely in Horace Kelling's death, but in the waste of a young man's potential through moral weakness and criminal ambition. The iron latchkey serves as an apt metaphor, Holmes mused as he selected a volume from our bookshelf. Edgar intended it to lock away the truth of his crime, yet instead it unlocked the door to justice. Criminal intelligence, however sophisticated, inevitably contains the seeds of its own destruction. The fire had burned low in the grate by the time we concluded our discussion of the case. Holmes had already begun arranging his notes for filing in the dispatch box, where he maintained records of our investigations, while I prepared to document the affair for potential future publication. The familiar sounds of London's evening traffic provided a comforting backdrop to our scholarly pursuits. As I took up my pen to begin the final draft of my account, I reflected upon the satisfaction that comes from seeing justice served through the application of reason and observation. The adventure of the iron latchkey had demonstrated once again that no crime, however cleverly planned, could long withstand the methodical investigation of a mind trained in the principles of logical deduction. Holmes had already turned his attention to the violin, and the first notes of a Bach partita filled our sitting room with their precise mathematical beauty. Outside our windows, London continued its eternal dance of commerce and society, while within our quiet sanctuary, the pursuit of truth had once again achieved its ultimate victory over the forces of deception and evil. And so, tonight's mystery closes like a rare book returned to its shelf, its secrets uncovered, its final page turned. What seemed bound in shadows has been revealed by reason, persistence, and the unyielding search for truth. Were you able to trace the clues before the last chapter? Share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading your theories. If you found yourself drawn into this case, please give the video a like and subscribe for more stories waiting to be discovered here in the Hidden Library. Your support helps keep these shelves alive with new mysteries. Until we meet again, keep your curiosity alive, your mind keen, and I will see you in the next episode.